Good morning, AP Bio. On your instructional video today, we're going to focus on mathematical analysis of genetics problems. So we're first going to focus on using the law of multiplication and the law of addition. Those probability laws we started to touch on yesterday, but we're going to revisit those today. After we finish the laws of probability, we're going to look at a genetics test, an experiment, and look at the data collected in that experiment to test a hypothesis. So many times when we test a hypothesis, we're going to use chi-square analysis. So we're going to use chi-square now to test a hypothesis on a genetics experiment. Before we start your guided notes, a couple quick announcements. On Sunday, your Mastering Biology on Meiosis is due. And on Monday, your AP Classroom quiz on meiosis and Mendelian genetics is due. Also, if you wanted to still improve your grade, you can submit revisions to your enzyme lab as well as your lectin lab. The enzyme lab revisions are going to be due on the 9th, and the lectin lab revisions are going to be due on the 11th. So go ahead and get out your guided notes. Turn to question 11. That question says, what fraction of offspring will have two or more recessive traits in a cross between a trihybrid? And I'm calling this a trihybrid because the genotype for P, Y, and R are all heterozygous. So tri meaning 3, and hybrid, we know hybrid means it's a heterozygous genotype. So this is a trihybrid, and it is crossed with an individual that is heterozygous for P, and then homozygous recessive for the Y and the R genes. So what I have to the right is I'm showing you those different phenotypes that go along with that genotype. So flower color is controlled by the gene for purple or white. That's denoted by the letter P. Seed color is either yellow or green. That's noted by the letter Y. And then seed shape is either round or wrinkled, and that's denoted by the letter R. The dominant phenotypes are purple, yellow, and round, and then your recessive phenotypes are white, green, and wrinkled. The other thing that I'm showing you on this slide is on your AP Biology equation sheet. They do list the laws of probability. I've been calling them the laws of multiplication or the law of addition. On your AP Biology equation sheet, they're just called the law of probability. So if we look at that, it says if A and B are mutually exclusive, then P, which means probability, P, A, or B equals PA plus PB. So that's talking about the law of addition. We see that word or there. So those are exclusive genotypes. They don't have to happen at the same time. If we ever see that word or, then we know that we're going to add probabilities together. However, if A and B are independent, we see that word probability of A and B. And means we're going to multiply those probabilities of those two together. So I want you to know that with the laws of multiplication and the law of addition, if you ever forget which one you should use, that's always on your equation sheet. If you see the word or on a genetics problem, you know that you're going to add those probabilities together. And if you see that word and, that means that you're going to multiply the probabilities. So the first thing that we're going to do to answer this question is we're going to list all the possible genotypes that fit the criteria of the question. So you're going to list all the possible genotypes that show two or more recessive traits. You can see now that I have those possible genotypes listed. Notice that you could be recessive for P, you could be recessive for Y, but the individual could be heterozygous for R. That's showing two recessive traits for that first genotype. The second genotype, you could be recessive for P and R, but heterozygous for Y. The third genotype, we are heterozygous for P, but recessive for Y and R. The fourth genotype, homozygous dominant for P, but homozygous recessive for Y and R. And then our last one, it says the fraction of offspring that will have two or more recessive traits. Here we have a genotype that has 3 recessive traits, so we need to make sure that we include the genotype that is recessive for P, Y, and R altogether. After we have listed all the possible genotypes that will meet the criteria of this genetics problem, we are not going to make a mega trihybrid cross. Instead, we are going to use a monohybrid cross for each specific gene. So notice here on our slide, I have a monohybrid cross for gene P. I have a monohybrid cross for gene Y, and then a monohybrid cross for gene R. I also put the phenotypes next to the genotypes of my mated pair. So you can see the trihybrid would have purple flowers, round yellow seeds, and then our second mated pair would have purple flowers and wrinkled green seeds. Other things I want to make sure that you're doing as you take your notes is that we're having good habits. Make sure that you are underlining your recessive alleles. That's going to help make sure that you interpret those monohybrid crosses correctly. After you've written all of those 3 monohybrid Punnett squares out, we're going to look at each of those genotypes that were listed. And when you look at each of those genotypes that were listed, we're going to multiply the probabilities of each of those genes together. So the probability of being homozygous recessive for P is 1/4. That's going to be multiplied by the probability of being homozygous recessive for Y, which is 1/2. And then we're going to multiply that by the probability of being heterozygous for R, and that is also 1/2. So 1 times 1 times 1 is 1, 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 2 is 16. So the probability of just that one genotype is going to be 1/16. I'd like you to now go through and use the law of multiplication to figure out the probability of the second genotype on our list. Okay, the second genotype on our list, it should be 1/4 for homozygous recessive P, 1/2 for heterozygous Y, and 1/2 for homozygous recessive R. If we multiply all of those probabilities together, it is 1/16. Now take a moment and go through and determine the probability of your third genotype. Okay, the third genotype, the probability of heterozygous P is 1/2. Probability of homozygous recessive Y is 1/2. And the probability of homozygous recessive R is 1/2. When we multiply those 3 probabilities together, we see that our probability of that genotype is 1/8. I've put a box around that. This is the first time that we've gotten a denominator with an 8. That's nothing for you to worry about. We'll go through and talk about why that that fraction looks different than the 1/16 that we've seen before, but that is the correct answer. Go ahead and do the next probability for your next genotype. Okay, so our fourth genotype, you should have a probability of 1/4 for homozygous dominant P, a probability of 1/2 for homozygous recessive Y, and a probability of 1/2 for homozygous recessive R. When we multiply those probabilities together, we get 1/16. And there's one more to go, the final probability for our last genotype. Calculate that now. Okay, now we have our final probability for our last genotype. It should be 1/4 times 1/2 times 1/2, and we get 1/16. So far we have looked at each of the genotypes, and we've always used the law of probability. This is looking to have at least 2 recessive traits in each of those genotypes. Our next step in this investigation is to use the law of addition. So we're going to add each of these probabilities together because this organism could have our first genotype or our second genotype or our third genotype or our fourth or our fifth genotype. So because they could have any of these genotypes, and we're using that word or, we're going to add these probabilities together. I'm coming back to the 1/8 for the probability of our third genotype. When we add fractions, remember that we have to have the same denominator. So I'm changing 1/8 into 2/16. That's going to help me add all of those fractions together. So if I add 1/16, 1/16, 2/16, 1/16, and another 1/16 altogether, that will total 6/16. And then we just have to reduce that to 3/8.